Hello, everyone. Just take a minute as people start coming into the webinar. My name is Dr. Tabitha Parker. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I'm the executive director of the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, and I just want to welcome everyone into the new year, 2021. This is our first webinar of the year. AIHM does a wellness webinar series that we've just started back up, and we're really excited to get that moving again this year. So for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine is a global interprofessional integrative health association working to transform healthcare, body, mind, spirit, community, and planet. And we started in 1978 as the American Holistic Medical Association, and over the years grew and then merged with the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine in 2014 and became the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine. So welcome, everyone. We're so glad that for those of you coming back, that you're here, and for those that are here for the first time, just really so blessed to have you. So we're very excited today with the upcoming holiday for Martin Luther King. We really wanted to highlight one of our speakers that came to our conference this year that has been such a leader in medicine, Dr. Richard Allen Williams. Dr. Williams founded the Association of Black Cardiologists in 1974 and the Minority Health Institute in 1987. He was an instructor in cardiology at Harvard Medical School, and while in this position, he worked to recruit a significant number of Black medical trainees to Boston hospitals for the very first time in their history. He was the first Black full professor in the history of the Department of Medicine at the UCLA School of Medicine. And he is the author of the textbook of Black-related diseases, which was published by McGraw-Hill in 1975, which detailed medical conditions peculiar to African Americans. It is widely considered the classic seminal work on the medical status of Blacks and is in the Library of Congress. Our second guest today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Jean Davis. She is a PhD, a chiropractor, a PA, and a fellow from our program here. She's also a new board member with the Academy. She is a community advocate, an educator, a clinician, and researcher. She received her doctoral degree in chiropractic medicine, a PhD in preventative medicine. She's a board member of the Beyond AIDS Foundation and of AIHM. She is the co-chair of the AIHM Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Task Force, and the past medical director and HIV clinician at AIDS Health Foundation, Desert AIDS Project, and a clinician at Dusk to Dawn Urgent Care. So to get us started, we are actually going to watch Dr. Williams's video, and then we'll have a conversation with Jean, and hopefully with all of you. We'll open it up to questions after the video.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Richard Allen Williams, and I'm going to be giving a talk today, which I hope that you will enjoy and hopefully learn some things from. The title of my talk is History of Medicine and the Disparity of Cardiovascular Disease. And you can see my titles there. I'm the founder and CEO and president of the Minority Health Institute. These are some further credentials that I'd like to present to you. I won't try to read through all of them. It says that I'm a professor of medicine at UCLA School of Medicine. I'm also editor and author of several books, including the textbook of Black-related diseases, as well as Humane Medicine, volumes 1 and 2, The Heart of the Matter, Eliminating Healthcare Disparities in America, Healthcare Disparities at the Crossroads with Healthcare Reform. I'm also the founder of the Association of Black Cardiologists, I founded the Central Recruitment Council at Harvard Medical School. I received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Harvard Medical School for my activities regarding promoting diversity at that institution. And I served as the 117th president of the National Medical Association. So that's a mouthful. I'll go beyond those credentials right into my presentation. I have no disclosures. And the first thing that I want to show is something that might be somewhat confusing to you, but let me explain it. I'm a fan, I guess you might say, of languages. I have learned several languages, and one of the languages is Mandarin Chinese. And in the Mandarin language, there's a word for what we call crisis in English. It actually consists of two characters, what we in Chinese call weiji, and that represents in English two words, which are both danger and opportunity. Now, I mention this because of the fact that we're in the midst of a pandemic, and the pandemic is threatening all of us. I want you to know that even though that is a crisis, that although it represents a great deal of danger, it also gives us a great deal of opportunity to make some changes, which perhaps this COVID-19 episode or pandemic was intended to bring before our eyes, or as we might say, unmask. You'll see more about that in just a moment. So let me continue on. Dr. Martin Luther King talked about healthcare disparities, and Dr. King was what you might say an advocate of the civil rights of health. And he said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through, because we're going to be talking about issues not only in regards to healthcare delivery, but of social justice, which is on all of our minds these days. And I'll be bringing some of those issues to the fore. Now I'm going to give you a little lecture about a number of things. This will be what I call a kind of a mixed bag. It will include history, and especially the history of Blacks in medicine, going back 5,000 years, and coming forward. Obviously, that's a lot to try to do in a half an hour, but I'll allude to a lot of things, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up on them and investigate them yourself. I'll not only be talking about historical facts, but I'll be talking about things that are in the current perspective, such as the COVID-19 crisis or pandemic that we're dealing with, and especially how it impacts disproportionately on communities of color. This is something that's very important for us to consider. So let's start with the ancient history, especially of African Americans or of Blacks. And I'm not going to be able to detail every single bit of this, but we'll start back 5,000 years ago to the days of this gentleman on my left, whose statue you see. He was called Imhotep, and he was actually considered the god of medicine. He was the first doctor whose name was recognized in the history of the world, and he lived 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. He was a sub-Saharan Egyptian, and was responsible for a number of things, which I can't detail now either. But one of the things that he did was he wrote the first textbook of medicine, which we call the Ebers Papyrus. And he also detailed a number of things such as that we recognize today. He was the first person, for instance, who recognized the beating of the heart and the circulation of the blood. Thousands of years before Sir William Harvey rediscovered that in England in 1628. In any event, remember the name Imhotep because he's the first doctor in history, and he happened to be Black. I'll move very rapidly forward. You see a number of things that through the ages we can recognize as significant in medical history. You can't perhaps see all of these things very well, but I'll try to detail some of them to you. For instance, there's a snake at the bottom of this slide, which indicates that this was something that was important that was developed. One of the what we call slave doctors developed a cure for snake bite in 1751, and I'll show you his picture in just a moment. But those were some of the things that were done by these so-called slave doctors. They didn't have formal medical degrees, they weren't even free, but they were able to do some practice which made a difference in saving the lives of some of the people, especially Black people back then. So we'll come further forward. I can't, again, give you much in the way of details, but what I'm doing now is to show you just little clips of different people in Black medical history who made a difference back in their day and whom you need to memorialize and know about, such as the gentleman in the lower right of this picture. That's Dr. William Hinton, who was the first Black medical professor at Harvard Medical School, which is where I did my training. And in 1924, he wrote a book, the first book written, textbook written by a Black doctor on the diagnosis and treatment of syphilis, which was a great scourge at that time. So, moving further forward, we can see other people. I'm going to back up for just a moment because there's a picture in the middle of this slide of Dr. Charles Richard Drew, after whom the Drew Medical School in Los Angeles is named. And he was the inventor of blood plasma. It's a Black doctor who did his research back in the 1940s and died unusually early. So I'm going to go past all of the rest of this into the intermediate history. And the first thing that you see in this intermediate history is a representation of a young slave girl kneeling on an examining table and a doctor standing in front of her. This is Dr. J. Marion Sims, who is called the father of modern American gynecology. And he was an absolutely ruthless researcher. He took slave girls around the country with him, doing experiments on them while they were naked on the examination table, and with people, not just doctors, but anybody looking in to show his experimentation that he did on them without anesthesia. These were gynecological experiments. A lot more that I wish I had time to say about this monster who has been absolutely glorified in regular American medical history and even had statues erected to him in Central Park in New York City. He also was one of the early presidents of the American Medical Association. So, to continue, there are several pictures of Black doctors whose names I'm not going to try to give you right now, but you can look them up in a book that I'm going to show you in just a moment. These are doctors who early on, back in the 1700s and 1800s, were able to get through medical school and practice medicine in the United States in the early days. That wasn't an easy job. It's not easy now for a Black doctor to practice. Imagine what it must have been like then. The doctor who is on the right is a doctor who actually was the first Black student to attend Harvard Medical School back in 1860s, and subsequently was rejected and ejected from Harvard Medical School by Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the dean at that time. This may not mean much to you, but it did mean a great deal, not only to him and also to history. He wasn't able to finish his medical education. he had to go on through preceptorship to get his MD, and then he joined the Army, where he became a major and a leader in the U.S. military. So Dr. Robinson Delaney is that gentleman. Here are the names of several of the earliest Black doctors and slave doctors in America. On my left are some of the doctors whose pictures I showed you, such as Dr. Martin Robinson Delaney. But Dr. Lucas Santamae was the first Black doctor to practice in the United States. Dr. James McCune Smith was the first doctor who was educated in a U.S. medical school. And we go on and on through all of these Black doctors on my left. There are several others in that early history, but these are the most outstanding ones. And as I mentioned, they had a very difficult time achieving their medical education. And I'm telling you all of this because of the fact that I'm going to come to a point where we'll be talking very briefly about the importance of having more Black doctors practicing in the United States to alleviate the healthcare disparities which we are faced with. On the right are the names of the earliest slave doctors in America. And they're called slave doctors because they were actually slaves who were allowed somehow to practice a little bit of medicine during their captivity, you might say. The most outstanding one was a gentleman at the top whose name was Onesimus. He was a slave, believe it or not, in Boston to a Dr. Cotton Mather, who is very famous in Harvard history. But back in the 1700s, he helped Dr. Mather to develop a vaccination cure for smallpox. And since we're talking about vaccines a great deal these days, that should resonate with you. This was an African who came to America, became enslaved, and brought with him the knowledge of inoculation. And that was used to save many, many lives in Boston. Believe it or not, he was reviled because he was a slave, and the people of Boston actually rioted and surrounded Dr. Mather's home in protest about having this Black man doing this great deed, no matter that he saved their lives. People are strange sometimes. So, continuing on, I'm not going to give you the names of all of these gentlemen that I just showed or associate them with their photographs, but bear in mind, there weren't very many of them. They were very courageous, and they saved so many lives back in the time when Black people didn't have anybody else to treat them. And there was one woman whose name was Rebecca Lee. She was the first Black female to practice medicine in the United States. She was a great hero, actually, who went on to treat people, especially slaves who fought in the Civil War back in the 1860s, and did a great job in saving their lives. And there was also, well, this is another picture, a portrait of her, Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first Black woman doctor in the United States. Well, we go on from there to what I call the Reconstruction period after emancipation. And that's important because during that period of time, the first Black medical schools were built. The first two were Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, I say the first two, eventually there were about 13 Black medical schools that were built because Black people had decided that especially after emancipation, as well as before emancipation, during slavery, they had to be responsible for their own treatment. And during that time, they developed methods of treatment, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which weren't exactly allopathic methods of treatment. to try to get over the health care disparities which had emanated from slavery. In any event, there were 13 medical schools that were developed over a short period of time up to 1910, when somebody in the United States government decided, hey, wait a minute, how come all these Black people are getting medical education in these schools? And by that time, hundreds of Black doctors were being turned out in these 13 schools. And so they commissioned a doctor who wasn't a medical doctor to do a study. And he did a survey of all the medical schools and decided that all of the Black medical schools needed to be eliminated, stopped, closed, except for Howard University and Meharry Medical College. And so that's the reason I call your attention to those two. And from those days, from 1910 up to the present time, only 2 more medical schools devoted to Black medical education have been opened. Those are Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia, and our own Charles R. Drew Medical School here in Los Angeles, about which we'll say a little bit more later on. So continuing with our medical perspective, we go into what I then call the Deconstruction Period. That's not an official period of time, that's my term. And I call it deconstruction because during that time, all of the gains that Black doctors and Black medicine had made were deconstructed. They were taken apart. There was actually a reconstruction committee which had taken charge of Black health, so to speak. They're the ones who built Howard University School of Medicine. But because of the fact that the government wanted to appease the Confederacy after they were defeated in the war, they did a great deal of things to harm the advances of Blacks, not only in Congress, but in medicine and so forth. You can read more about that. During this era that things were being developed for Blacks in medicine, there arose a particular organization which I have been privileged to be president of a few years ago, and it was called the National Medical Association. This is the time when Blacks decided they had to achieve Black medical autonomy if they were going to be able to survive. Because, and here's something that I want you to remember. Back in the 1800s, there was a gentleman named Hoffman, who was a demographer and statistician, who did a survey. He was actually commissioned by Prudential Insurance Company, which, by the way, insured slaves for the slave masters. Hoffman did a survey of the entire slave population of the United States to determine how good their health was. And in fact, this was the first survey looking at healthcare disparities in the United States. He came back after a year of surveying the slave population and predicted that the Black race, based on his findings, had such poor health care that they would be extinct by the year 2000. And that is a fact, that he was able to make that determination based on his figures. Now, obviously, Blacks are still with us, but if you read between the lines, what he was saying was that the healthcare disparities that we have been suffering since over the past 401 years since slavery began took a terrible toll on the slave population, which was projected to take an even worse toll as time went on. And certainly that has been true. And that's what we're dealing with right today. So here's a picture of the National Medical Association, or the NMA, at its Boston convention in 1909. Remember that it had been organized just a few years before, because it was founded in 1895 at the Cotton States exhibition in Atlanta, Georgia. And it is still surviving today. It is the premier medical organization representing the Black population in the United States and is 50,000 strong. And as I mentioned, I am happy and proud to have led that organization as its president. That's Professor William Augustus Hinton of Harvard Medical School, whom I referred to before. And this is Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who I consider the greatest historian of Blacks in medicine. He was one of my mentors and has been cited for his studies in anatomy. He was a professor and chair of anatomy at Howard University College of Medicine. And as I said, he was the major historian of Blacks in medicine. Nobody was ever better. Here's a picture again of Dr. Charles R. Drew, and as I mentioned, the Drew University's School of Science, Medicine and Science here in Los Angeles is named for this great warrior. I have a picture here of the Watts Riots, as they were called, in Los Angeles, and Drew University was not even formed at that time. But the reason that the two are drawn together in this picture is because of the fact that I want to call attention to your attention to the fact that these riots were occurred because of the fact that the people in South or South Central Los Angeles, as it was called, did not have any center of medical activity. They didn't have a hospital. If you got sick and needed to be hospitalized or go to the hospital, if you were a resident of Watts, you had to travel about 30 miles across Los Angeles, which is a huge area, as you know, to go to the hospital. And in fact, the Watts riots may have been instigated by the fact that a young man was transporting his pregnant wife across town. She was about to deliver, she was at term. They were stopped because of speeding by the police. And when he protested, he was shot dead. Well, of course, people didn't take too kindly to that. And shortly thereafter, and also because of some other incidents that occurred, the Watts riots broke out. On the ashes of those riots rose Dr. Martin Luther King Hospital and the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. And so you can see the very good connection there between them. I'm going to move on very rapidly. In my book, I wrote, as I mentioned, 9 books. And this was from the first book that I wrote, which is a picture of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a distant relative of mine, who was a surgeon in Chicago, who started Providence Hospital, the first hospital owned by Blacks in the United States. And in 1873, he performed the first operation on a living human heart, although that has been refuted by some white historians. I have proof that he was the first to do that. And yet that doesn't appear in the regular history books. So I call that to your attention. It is in my book. And here's another book that I wrote that I want to refer you to. It's called Blacks in Medicine. I just published it 2 months ago. This is my 9th book, Clinical, Demographic, and Socioeconomic Correlations. All those words are meaningful, and this book is meaningful in regards to the lecture that I'm giving you today, because it contains a great deal of information about healthcare disparities, which I cannot give you verbally today, but which I certainly urge you to look at in the book. So I don't want to promote it too much, but in any event, I think it's important, especially in these times for you to get this kind of information to weigh in on the social injustices that are occurring, especially in regards to medical and healthcare delivery for Blacks and other people of color in this country. So that's Blacks in Medicine. The other reason that you might want to look at this book is because it calls attention to the fact that Blacks have always had to depend on unusual, or what you might call non-allopathic forms of medical care in order to survive. And although, again, I cannot give you great detail about it, those slave doctors and early Black doctors that I showed you before were experts in the use of various non-allopathic medications and treatments, which made a difference in saving Black lives. Black people didn't have the comfort and opportunity to avail themselves of white medical care at that time. Whites didn't want them in their hospitals or in their waiting rooms, and they didn't have any money to pay white doctors anyway. So they had to depend on themselves. And that's the reason that they built their own medical schools, and the reason that they developed their own forms of treatment, and also their own medical organizations like the National Medical Association, to try to depend on themselves. Now, part of my title for this talk has to do with cardiology or cardiovascular healthcare disparities. And this is the cover of a journal which I received. It's called Cardiology, and I'm a cardiologist. And you can see that the title on this journal is Health Disparities and Social Determinants of Health, Time for Action. And this brings us very much up to the current time when we are in the midst of concerns not only about social justice, but about the social determinants of health and the healthcare disparities, which we've been talking about for years. I'm going to have a great deal more to say about it as I finish up my presentation, but I want to call your attention to this monster, which you should be able to recognize as the COVID-19 virus. And you can see the spike proteins, which are projecting out. Those are the things that they use to get inside your cells and to infect you. And so I just wanted to use that to kick off my very brief talk about COVID-19, and particularly about the cardiovascular impact of COVID-19, and especially in people of color. So there's evidence of heart injury that might be found in up to 80% of patients who develop COVID-19 infection. It may include arrhythmias, heart failure, myocarditis, blood clots, strokes, myocardial infarction, etc. And inflammation of the heart may be found more than a month after COVID-19 diagnosis. In other words, people think that they are cured, but they're not. And athletes may take a long time to recover full strength. So I wanted to give you some pointers on cardiovascular disease under COVID-19. It is deadly, and you have to keep in mind, especially considering what President Trump is going through now with his lung infection, that lung infection is not the be-all and end-all with COVID-19. Cardiovascular disease has a great impact, and especially with people of color. So here's a long list which I cannot even read to you, but in the current medical era, and I'm coming towards conclusion now, we have, under healthcare reform, a number of things that have occurred since the American Medical Association was created in 1857. And between then and now, up to the passage of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, in 2010, there have been a number of things that have been developed and that have occurred that have impacted upon medical care for people in Black and brown communities, which we have to be concerned about. You can perhaps look at that very briefly and understand that many of these things are political things, but some of them have to do with things that are at the very center of trying to impact upon healthcare disparities. This is from Harvard Magazine, and I thought that it might be something to give you perhaps a nice little picture of what skin is all about and how important it is in considering healthcare disparities. And what it says is the skin is the body's largest organ. It deflects danger, heralds disease, and captures sensory stimuli. And in this pandemic, its color might mean the difference between life and death. Now, I want you to keep that in mind because that makes a very powerful message in regards to the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has between white and Black communities and also Latinx communities. We die more commonly, we get the disease more commonly, and deal with it less easily than whites do. And that is something that has to be taken into consideration, especially as we transition into the era of the vaccines, which we're entering into now, the development of vaccines. Wish I had more time to talk about that. But this just gives you a disproportionate mortality rates. Blacks are 3.5 times, and Latinx community members 2 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than whites. And Latinx are 60% of new cases, 50% of deaths, and 18% of the population, only 18%. And this is something that should impress you. In 2020, more Black Americans will die of COVID-19 than succumb to diabetes, strokes, accidents, or pneumonia. In fact, COVID-19 is now the 3rd leading cause of death for Black Americans. Keep that in mind. Here's a cartoon that I'm going to be finishing up with. There's a Black lady who's visiting with a white doctor, and she says, "Give it to me straight, doc. I can take it. What's wrong with me?" And he says, "You're not a white male." What that means is he's alluding to the fact that the people who get the best care and the best attention in this country medically are not Black females, certainly, not even white females, certainly not Black males. They're white males. Now, that's okay for white males to get great medical treatment. It's certainly not okay for the rest of us not to receive the same level of care that they do. Keep that one in mind. Finally, Black lives do matter, and I put this Time magazine cover on there to remind you of that. And in conclusion, I want to say that no matter where we start or whatever system we use in healthcare delivery, no matter whether it's integrative, complementary, traditional, homeopathic, or allopathic, the common denominator is systemic racism. We must utilize all of our resources to eliminate this destructive virus from our society. Otherwise, it will eliminate us. This is the message of COVID-19. I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. And remember what Senator Kamala Harris said, there is no vaccine for racism. We've got to do things in medicine to eliminate systemic racism in various ways. And I leave it for all of you to determine what those methods might be. Thank you so much.
So I want to thank you all for being here and for watching with us and participating. And I want to welcome Dr. Jean Davis that is going to be just talking a little bit about Dr. Williams's work and the work that she does and engaging us in a conversation around the challenges we face with systemic racism in our system today. So Dr. Jean, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Tabby. I just want to welcome all of you for coming out, especially on this special day, which is actually Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And I'd like to say a quote from him that's really important to me. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in times of comfort, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. And with what's going on in this world today, when we look at health equity, the lack of, when we look at the violence that occurred in the Capitol, we really need to see what side we're going to stand on. And I hope we all stand on the side of humanity. I'd like to start off by asking a couple of questions that I developed in reference to the presentation. And I just want to know what you think about things. Okay, so do you think doctors would have a reduction in overt discrimination and or implicit bias if they knew that the first medical doctor was Black? Do you think that would have helped the impact of the way that some white physicians treat community of color? What are your thoughts?
So Jean, and I'll invite people who are here with us on the Zoom call to just put your thoughts either in the chat, or you can use the question feature to add any comments, and we can kind of have a conversation with Dr. Jean. Julie says, yes, she does think it's important.
Yes, and that's why I think it's so important that we not only include history of medicine, but history across the board of people of color. It's so often thought that we don't contribute anything, but we need to make sure that history is there for everyone to know. Someone else said, I agree, but it needs to start with, and I can't see the rest of that, Tabby. What does that say?
Oh, teaching Black history in elementary school. So really, like,
absolutely.
Just the whole, I do think that this is just such an important issue, you know, as we as integrative providers, when we think about just holistic systems, right? And really it's about us approaching things right from the foundation, right? You think about nutrition and all these basic needs. It's the same thing if we don't take an approach with really reteaching our community from the beginning, and starting that with children, and not only just in medical school, right? I mean, that would address specifically here, but within the larger context of society, how do we really start to, you know, tell a true collective history together?
And I do agree, we do have issues with acknowledging our history, and we really need to do that. You want to read some of the other comments, Tabitha?
Yeah, so I had a question around, you know, how Black medical history impacts health equity. And, you know, and also just from, you know, how that would potentially trickle down to patients and how they also experience themselves within a system. And so I just wanted to see if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, you know, I think that that's really important, because if you don't think you're part of something, why would you participate in it? And the knowledge that there are Blacks who actually did a lot in medicine would probably increase the number of patients that were not only adherent to the plans, but also participate in things like vaccine trials and so on and so forth. Oftentimes, what we've had is all the negative things that happen to Blacks in medicine, rather than looking at the positive things that Black providers have done. Prime example is William Hale, Williams, the guy who did the first open heart surgery. Charles Drew. Wasn't for Charles Drew, we may not have won the war, because he's the one who did the blood banks. So I think if we know that kind of information, it will increase the foundation. Also with the slave doctor who brought the knowledge from inoculation from Africa to the United States, was actually started the first vaccine. So when we know those kind of things, we know what part we played in those in history, it's easier for us to understand, accept, and participate to improve our own health.
You know, that's such a great point, Jean. You know, I just kind of think about, you know, most, at least in medicine and in health curriculums, most people at some point have learned about Tuskegee, but they don't learn about the positives. And when you think about the community of patients too, like how that could shift people's, you know, in many cases, just very valid concerns um, to really highlight those accomplishments. That could be just such a wonderful approach. And there's lots of just chat feedback talking about acknowledging the truth of our history and how this is bringing to light outdated education systems. Mira Patel is saying, you know, an inconsistency with truth in many of our textbooks and curriculum, really a need to revise textbooks and think about how and what are we teaching. There's been such a default in health education in particular around, you know, kind of the standard of care of what you teach, that I think some of these concepts get lost with that.
And as parents of young children, I think it's important for us to stand up and say, you know, for example, when the school would send a list of explorers for my sons to do a report on, and I say, no, he's going to report on this explorer who is of African heritage. The same thing when they did it on medicine. You know, Williams, Drew, they were the ones we were going to do it on. So sometimes it's important for us to advocate for our own knowledge, not just to depend upon history books.
So I wanted to ask you another question. I think everyone who watched Dr. Williams's talk, both at the conference and today, just the impact of seeing the gynecological experimentation that was, you know, allowed and then really in some ways honored. But, you know, do you think that that experimentation on Black slave women has impacted the recent past and present medical abuse of women of color?
I think so, because it was accepted then, it continued to be accepted. And we've had talks in the academy before about the Mississippi appendectomies, which meant that there were so many hysterectomies done on Black women in Mississippi in the 50s and the 60s, they just started calling them appendectomies. When we look at the sterilization of Native Americans, which was done by our government, you know, and then when we look at the sterilization of Latino women, who it was done at USC in the 60s and the 70s. So this has continued. And I think with the knowledge of what we have here, we can say, this is where this started from, and we need to stop it. It is no longer acceptable.
So you know, you bring up a really important point that I think often what happens is, you know, you hear the rhetoric around, well, slavery ended, right? But we have these very modern and very relevant continued cases of how this is really happening all the time. Within the medical, you know, you were talking about the USC situation and many others. And so really it's about learning about that. We have a question from the audience just around, she's a teacher and would love to learn more about this information to share with kids. Are there any suggestions for legitimate resources for more information?
There is a book called the History on African Americans, and there's another one called The History on the Negro. And I will give that information to you because ironically, I had it for my sons when they were growing up, and I bought it for each one of their families for the grandchildren to look at too. And they have another one that's for younger kids that's more of a cartoon base, but it talks about all the accomplishment of Americans of African ancestry. So after the talk, we can put that on our website. Is that a possibility, Tabby?
Sure. We can send it also out to at least those who are participating via Zoom. We can send you some resources for sure. Okay. There's another question or comment. Yes, I agree. You both bring up the takeaway point for me, which is to locate university level history that can then inform the history for the children's history books as well.
Yes. And the thing about it, you know, with search engines now, it's not as difficult as it used to be. You don't have to go sit in a library and look through the catalog. We can actually search for things. And if I get a quick break, I will search for that name of that book and I will give it to you now.
Great. Yes, of course. We have another comment coming in from one of the participants. She says that the book on Henrietta Lacks is being read and discussed in our high schools. Finally, it stimulates interesting and heated debate in my home.
Yes.
So, you know, again, it's just about around that that the bringing in of history
Yes.
and telling a full history is so, so important. I had another question. Do you think the fact that Onesimus, I think I'm saying his name right, the Black slave doctor that provided the foundation for inoculation,
Mhm.
based on knowledge he acquired in Africa, would impact Black Americans' outlooks on vaccines?
I
So,
think it would. Just as when the information came out about the Black woman, I don't recall her name right now, who worked on one of the vaccines. She actually did the foundation for the vaccines that we're doing now for COVID. It inspired people to understand that, you know, we as a Black person would not develop something to hurt us. So, you know, sometimes that's really important to be able to see someone of color that's there with you. I'm an HIV specialist, and in the 90s and the early 2000s, people were still dying from HIV. And I found that a lot of the patients were not adherent to medication because they didn't believe they had HIV and they thought the medication was going to kill them. But when they would talk to me, I'd ask the question, do you really think I would give you something that would hurt you? I'm like you. And they were more adherent to their medication, having an understanding that a person of color would not try to do anything to hurt them.
yeah, so that, just again, it comes back to that highlighting of, it's like we need a marketing campaign
Yes,
nationally around, all of the
all of it.
incredible accomplishments.
Yeah.
And, what we're facing with the challenge of COVID is just so serious. I mean, we're here in California. I mean, many of you are in the systems. We hear from our members every day of the challenges and how it's just gotten so difficult. And, we really need to think out of the box around how to get everyone, comfortable with all of the resources we have for us in this area. So I have another question. What's your opinion of Hoffman's statistical evaluation as it relates to the life expectancy of the Black race?
Well, according to him, we should have been gone by 2000. And it's 2021 now, so I'm glad he was wrong. But what he was looking at was the healthcare and the treatment of Blacks in America. And based upon what he saw, he just knew we were going to be extinct by 2000. And when you look at the healthcare now, when you look at all the preventable deaths among people of color, it's amazing that we are still here. The things that we've had to go through, from malnutrition to physical abuse to psychological abuse, all of the Jim Crow, the Black codes, all that stuff. I mean, even what's going on now, looking at the pipeline from school to prison, looking at the psychological abuse that is occurring in schools with police officer arresting 5-year-olds. I mean, it's a lot to have to deal with. And when we looked at the unrest last week, if you would have had a little bit more color to your skin, that would have never happened. You would have gotten nowhere near that Capitol. And we see the duplicity of protection. We're not protected. The people who went in the Capitol, they had no fear that they were going to be shot. None whatsoever. And I was watching on TV this morning how one of the DC police officers said, we've been doing Blue Lives Matter, so you're on our side, right? So they felt that they could have the right to break the law because they were saying Blue Lives Matter rather than Black Lives Matter. So it's very interesting. Even in 2021, we still don't have the same systems that we would have if we were white.
So a few more comments, and then we are going to have to close up here pretty soon. But we have a few things I just wanted to share. Someone saying that the Tuskegee study was part of her nursing curriculum many years ago. Another comment, I think we also need to acknowledge many Indigenous people's knowledge and longstanding medicine traditions
Absolutely.
that were taken from them and hijacked in our history.
Yes.
We certainly are, in conversations around that, just in the integrative health community, and how, all of the integrative health practices really came at one point or another from Indigenous roots. And yes, yet we don't have any Indigenous faces, right?
Yes.
Externally in that larger movement. You think about yoga in this country, and many different, our naturopathic profession. So thank you for that comment. Another comment, I just started reading Black Man in a White Coat by Damon Tweedy, highly recommend it. Let's see, here we have a comment from the EPA website. The EPA website says in September 2006, the World Health Organization declared its support for the indoor use of DDT in African American countries, where malaria remains a major health problem, citing that benefits of the pesticides outweighed the health and environmental risk. The WHO position is consistent with the Stockholm Convention on POPs, which bans DDT for all uses except for malaria control. Does this seem wrong to anyone else? So, you know, these are the, you know, I personally, I will say that, you know, I worked in Nicaragua for many years, and the challenges of some of those broader recommendations, the WHO had a variety of recommendations that when they were implemented in the communities where I worked, where mostly campesino farmers were working, and then you saw the health effects from the use of pesticides, and you know, they would spray diesel, for example, mixed with certain pesticides, and all of the health workers, you know, just were, they would have effects from that. So I do think that this also is making us aware that there are many of these types of recommendations that we have to go back, just like in history, and kind of relook at more holistically from this lens. Dr. Jean, do you have any final comments or words that you'd like to share?
I just thank everyone for coming and spending their lunch hour with us. And we as healthcare providers, we as teachers, we as just Americans, we can do better. We can do so much better than what we are doing. And when they say this isn't America, this is America, but we can make America a lot better than what it is. This is our democracy. We have to fight for it. Thank
you, Jean. So I just want to invite all of you again to our continued wellness webinars. So what's next? You can sign up for our emails, and then you'll get the invites for the weekly webinars and meditations. This Monday, we will have a special MLK Day Monday meditation with Dr. Scarlett Soriano. We're really excited for this, so please come join us. It's at 8:30 a.m. Pacific time, and it's just 15 minutes, so it's just a nice way for all of us to kind of come together as a community and start our week out. And then next Friday, the AIHM Wellness webinar is just so pleased to host Dr. Datis Karazian, who is a PhD. He is a chiropractor and has will be a PhD, and will be speaking to us about GI issues. I also want to just remind everyone that International Integrative Health Day is January 23rd. It's coming up here in a couple weeks, and we'll be really excited to be celebrating that, and we'll be asking our community to participate in Integrative Health Day as well. So stay connected with us. You can, all of our wellness webinars and meditation Mondays are free. They are, you can find them on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AIHM Global. And please join our channel. We're trying to get over 1,000 likes on there. We have a Twitter handle and a Facebook. We live stream our wellness webinars as well to our Facebook page at AIHM Global, and think about joining our membership as well. So again, thank you all. Happy 2021, and just really look forward to working with all of you this year. Blessings.